voted on who they thought that recipient would be. So we're very honored to be able to present that today. Hopefully you'll be around for that. So first up, we have Representative Travis Fitzwater and Representative Tracy McCreary of the Missouri House of Representatives. They'll be going over what happened during 2020 legislative session and what they see coming up in the upcoming session. Pardon me, I have a frog in my throat this morning. So I think if I'm correct, Representative Fitzwater, you're going first. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can start us off.
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be here with you all, and always enjoyed talking to your group about energy policy. Obviously, it's a big deal to my district. My district's in mid-Missouri, so in central Missouri, we have a lot of energy issues, but in particular, the nuclear power plant, the only one in the state of Missouri, is right on the border of my district. A lot of the employees in Ameren that work there are constituents of mine. So energy policy is a really big deal to my district. When I originally ran for office and I went knocking on doors, thousands and thousands of doors, the two issues that I heard the most about, one were state employee pay increases, which have a lot of state employees also in Missouri, and Ameren policy or energy policy, nuclear policy. Where do you stand on nuclear power? Where do you stand on energy infrastructure? Those type of issues. So energy policy has obviously been a big part of my career, my 6 years in the legislature, and have really enjoyed being a part of it. Super complex. Came in knowing nothing about energy policy other than we have a nuclear power plant and I had to fight for it. But have learned a lot and have really been honored to be in the legislature and to eventually become the chair of the Utilities Committee in my last term was really, really neat to be a part of that conversation on a kind of on a grander level. So really have enjoyed that and have enjoyed my career, and being on here with Tracy. Tracy and I have a really good relationship. You're not going to, the media won't show you Republicans and Democrats can get along, and we certainly have our disagreements, but we've worked together very well. And utility policy is, you're going to have very significant disagreements on many levels, and have certainly had that. We've had our ups and downs, but I think utility policy is one that doesn't require a lot of Republican Democrat persuasion. It just requires understanding the issues and landing on a side. And so that's been kind of something I've appreciated about utilities, at least the last 2 years that I've been there, is as the chair, was just trying to ensure that the conversation is heard on all sides and making decisions going forward based on what the members think the policy is best, and not based on political jabs from the left or right. So that's been, I really enjoyed serving with Tracy in that capacity. And I don't know if I need to get into issues yet, because I think Tracy and I kind of wanted to talk through some of the stuff we see coming up. But I think important issues you guys are already covering. Certainly we don't. It's kind of funny, the cannabis policy. It'd be interesting to hear what comes of that. But we don't take much of that on in utilities. But the eminent domain that you guys have coming up, the whole grain belt issue, we've had a pretty significant discussion on that over the years, and we've attached that to bills and utilities, to Tracy's great dismay, many times. But we've had that discussion on eminent domain, whether or not these out of state corporations should have the authority, to the same authority as an investor owned utility through the PSC has to gather property to expand their projects. It's a very interesting conversation, but it's very in the weeds. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic to have in the Capitol. So eminent domains is really an interesting conversation. The infrastructure surcharge recovery, ISRIS. I'm sorry, infrastructure recovery surcharge, the ISRIS, is an interesting discussion also. How do you pay for developing the infrastructure going forward? How do you ensure that every little expenditure by a utility isn't doesn't have to go before the PSC to get a huge hearing on for a rate case, but it can be kind of built out over years, and then added into rate cases as they're filed. Rate cases are very expensive, so that's kind of been an interesting discussion on ISRIS because we use that on a number of different power levels, you know, gas, water, things like that. We've had those discussions over the last couple of years, so that's an interesting issue going forward. And then, you know, the energy policy in general, Tracy and I joke about the energy plan we try to pass every year. That's certainly on the table, but as far as economic development, it's fascinating the dynamics of the market. You know, the market's just bigger than even Missouri. So like, for instance, solar, what's happening in solar power is very fascinating because that's just really kind of created its own market. It's, you know, we've kind of, for the most part, we've stayed out of solar. We've obviously given Missouri residents, they've gotten credits for putting solar on their homes, but it's a unique situation in solar, and it's growing significantly. It's a very interesting dynamic going forward. So there's kind of these markets for energy that are really fascinating to me to follow because it really impacts our state's economy in a significant way, not only for energy, providing energy, but just for tax dollars, for creating the economy we have that's very vibrant in the state of Missouri, even amid COVID. And then, you know, COVID's a whole different discussion. How do we do policy amidst a dynamic that we don't really even understand to this point, even after 9 or 10 or 11 months of kind of being under its authority, the pandemic. So, you know, those are the things that stick out that are hills we're trying to climb, and I think that are important policy going forward.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was going to welcome you as well, Representative McCreary. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Representative Fitzwater, for kicking things off. Like Travis mentioned, I'm on the House Utilities Committee. I'm the ranking minority member. We still don't have our committee assignments for 2021, so fingers crossed I'm still on utilities next year. One of the things that's interesting as I've worked with this organization and looked at the agenda are some of the issues that are important to the work that many of you do. Not all of those bills come through the Utilities Committee, interestingly enough. So for example, things dealing with Greenbelt Express and eminent domain, those are issues that depending what session it is, it's the speaker's prerogative to decide what bills get assigned to which committee. And then of course, once session gets going, for example, that ban on the use of eminent domain, that bill got put on as an amendment on all kinds of things. So towards the end of session, it seemed like everybody was keeping their eyes open for that. So session gets kicked off. Fingers crossed, everybody stays healthy. The swearing in for the House and the Senate is January 6th of 2021. So in a few weeks, we will be doing something resembling the 2021 session. You know, the big thing last year is, besides the issues that Representative Fitzwater mentioned, is the issue of COVID. Really both physically impacted the work that we were able to do in the legislature, you know, and then of course, from a legislative perspective, we had to really switch gears as well. So I anticipate that COVID will be something that not only really truncated our session this year in 2020, but will really have a lingering effect as we move into 2021. So my hope is that the majority party will prioritize things so that if we do end up having to have the building closed down for a couple of weeks here and there because of a COVID outbreak, that at the very least, we're doing things that our constituents, that the people of Missouri want us to do. So, you know, there were several bills dealing with surcharges last year with ISRIS. The bill dealing with Spire for gas ISRIS, the gas surcharge, did make it across the finish line, but there was another one lingering out there dealing with Missouri American Water. So I anticipate that might be something that comes up in 2021 as well. So my perspective on that is, I'm very concerned. I don't like surcharges, and when I think about my constituents, I represent mid St. Louis County. So I go right down highway, I-64, Highway 40, right down the middle of St. Louis County from Olivet all the way out to Chesterfield. So I've got a lot of really big businesses and residential, of course. And I want to make sure that things that we're doing are sensitive to all the bills that people pay, whether they're citizens or businesses. So I'm really, surcharges are something that I'm really not a fan of, but I understand that there are times that we need to have those discussions. So, and Representative Fitzwater is absolutely right. We have had many a disagreement on public policy issues, but I appreciate working with him on this committee because I think he epitomizes how we can disagree on issues, but not be disagreeable with each other. So I just want to thank him for that professionalism.
Fantastic. We do have one question. Jennifer Campbell had asked for a little bit more detail on the eminent domain bill. What are the particular points there that you all discussed and feel were at conflict?
That's a great question, and I won't tell you where Representative McCreary stands on things. We see differently. I'm a Republican, she's a Democrat, so we see differently on some policy, but we agree on a lot of policy as well. I think the eminent domain issue had a number of problems from her perspective, but for me, the real question was, should this out-of-state company be able to go into these heritage farms and take large swaths of their land to provide this power source through the state of Missouri, without really having gone and done the work at the front end of asking the property owners if they'd be willing to sell the property in the first place. And so I think that was probably the catalyst on the Republican side, was to protect farmers, to protect these heritage farms that have been in families, for some of them for over 100 years, that have been passed down from generation to generation. To have a company come in and grab property is not a thrilling idea. There's certainly uses for eminent domain. I don't think we'd all say that we should ban eminent domain across the board, because there's certainly areas where maybe that would be useful. I don't want to give an example because I don't know of any off the top of my head, but we've given investor-owned utilities eminent domain power over the years for their power lines. They've used it for decades. And for this out-of-state company to get the authority to do the same thing that the investor-owned utilities have done for decades really gave a lot of Republicans like myself heartburn, especially when these farmers were coming out very, very opposed to having their land taken in this fashion. So I think that from our perspective, that was why we weren't thrilled with it. Now getting renewable energy across the state would be fascinating, but the project also didn't say that we're going to build these lines and Missouri's getting all the power. That's not how that worked. It was basically you're getting a small percentage of the power after a big stir was caused. Originally, it was just going to be power lines pushed through the state, and Missouri wasn't going to benefit from any of the power that was going across those lines. I think the Grain Belt saw the organization, the company saw the writing on the wall, and they decided that they were going to sell some of the power within the state and decided to do a small percentage. I think it was 12.5 or 15 or 20%, something like that. They sold to a handful of municipalities across the state. And that helped them, I think, make a case to the PSC that they should have the authority to use eminent domain. But I think a lot of us want to see renewable energy used in the state, but I don't know if getting that done through the use of eminent domain and taking away portions of heritage farms is the best way to do that. And so that was the big hang up from my perspective.
Okay, Representative McCreary?
Yeah, It's a great question. You know, my perspective and my caucus's perspective is that transmission lines are absolutely crucial to society because we need to consume power. So, you know, the transmission lines provide a very valuable public service. And last year, this session was the second year the legislature has tried to undo some of the things that the Public Service Commission spent year after year after year reviewing. And, you know, so I was quite frustrated with the effort to be able to attempt to block one company. So I feel like that what we are trying to do actually is unconstitutional because it's basically targeting one company, one project. And, you know, there are already farms of all shapes and sizes that have transmission lines near their property lines through their property. And this bill and these amendments as put on bills, it doesn't do it. Privately owned companies like Ameren will still be able to build power lines, and utilities all over the state right now already have the ability to build transmission lines and will have the right to do that even if this bill passes. So my concern is that this is targeting one specific company, and I think that we need to be sensitive to many, it's not just a handful of municipalities. There are many communities around the state of Missouri that will benefit from very affordable energy. And some of these are communities that are already struggling financially. So if we can do something to lower the utility bills for folks that are struggling, I think that's the right thing to do.
Well, obviously it looks like we still have a lot to talk about, and hopefully this afternoon we'll hear a little bit more on how that program or project is being updated, and we'll see where we can go from there. But stay tuned, everyone. I was wondering, are either of you familiar with the issue of securitization, coal fire plant retirement?
I am very nominally. We had Tracy and I were talking about this before we got we started the broadcast, but we did have a bill from, I'm pretty sure it was Representative O'Donnell out of St. Louis. And he's a financial advisor from what I recall. And he kind of has his background in the financial world and military. And he filed a bill, I think it was 2 years ago, that we heard at the very end of session just to give him an initial hearing to try to give him some momentum going into the next session. And then I don't remember hearing much about it this last year. I don't think it was much of a priority. But there was a discussion on how we, at the very end of session in 2019, about securitization of coal plants going forward.
Exactly, the representative's right. I think one of the things I love about this committee is I can imagine that we might have multiple hearings on an issue as complex as securitization. And these are some really big changes in the industry. I can't imagine that would be something that would happen in 1 or even 2 sessions, even if it was a priority. So I would say that you and your members who have an interest in this are going to probably be spending, once it becomes, if it were to get on the speaker's radar as a priority, that we should gear up for several sessions of discussion on this pretty complex subject.
And
I
think that's okay. I think that things are changing so swiftly too, that even though it feels like things are changing in the energy environment so swiftly, you know, with new technologies and solar and nuclear innovations and some of these things that are happening, we also have, you know, it's very slow also. You know, the retiring of coal plants in Missouri isn't going to happen for a while, but we need to have this discussion about how do we securitize those now, so we're not, you know, left with the bag at some point down the road. And I think that's an important conversation to have. But Representative McCreary is exactly right. It's going to take a little bit of time to wade through such a complex issue like that.
Well, and one thing I want to add that applies to the issues that all of you care about, but it applies to anything really, is that because of term limits in the state of Missouri, most of us, even if we serve our full term or full time, we can only serve a max of 8 years in the House or and 8 years in the Senate. So for those of you that care about an issue, you really need to be doing planning within your organization to continually be educating people, because there are new people coming in all the time. We have 2 giant classes of new people coming in on January 6th. So, I don't think any of you will ever get to a point where you can say, okay, everybody on this committee understands the issue, because just when you get somebody like me brought up to speed on something, I'm going to term out. So we need you guys to constantly be working.
It's really important now. Yeah, it's a great point, because right now, going in January, going into this new session, over half of the legislature haven't been there for more than 2 years. So in the last 2 classes, we've turned over 50% of the legislature. That's a significant new group of people that need education.
So 2020 definitely not only impacted the economy, people's jobs, how they're working, how they're teaching their kids. It also impacted both of you in the Capitol, and how the session went. Any thoughts on how you see 2021 shaping up? Do you see it'll be normal? Any expectations of how the process or engagement with constituents will change?
Wow, it's a mystery. I mean, at this point right now, we're planning to be in the building a lot. For example, my husband's going to be building a spit guard kind of thing to put around my legislative assistant's desk in preparation for people coming and wanting to meet in person. But yeah, I think so much of this is mysterious and is going to really depend on how well we as Missourians decide that we're going to, take this virus seriously. I truly believe that we can get the people's work done and do it in a healthy, safe manner, but there's some basic rules that will need to be followed. One of my concerns just personally is when I look at my colleagues, there's 163 of us in the Missouri House. Many of our colleagues have health issues themselves, or we know that back home, back in their districts, they're taking care of folks with serious health issues. So I want to make sure anything we do that we're respectful of people's health. But one of my frustrations with session this spring of 2020 is I have great respect for what the speaker and others were trying to do as far as keeping the building safe and clean. But my concern is that it sent a message to the public that we weren't open to hear their feedback. It made it very hard for people to come in and testify and things like that. So I think whatever we do, we have to figure out a way that constituents, that citizens, lobbyists, everybody can have their opinions heard.
Representative Fitzwater, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just think normal's not an option. I think we're in a unique time, and it's not going to be normal. We're not going to see school groups. I would assume we won't see any school groups in the building. Usually the building is packed with, 4th grade classes that come in from across the state and get to see their legislative process in action and get to tour the building. And it's a beautiful, gorgeous building. So I hate to think that the citizens of Missouri can't experience it and be there, but it's a unique time. I think with the nature of the pandemic too, you're going to have legislators that are in contact with COVID that are going to be disqualified for short periods of time to be in the building. And so you're going to have delays in times. The House being the size that it is probably isn't as concerning maybe to miss time as maybe the Senate would be, because if you have 3 or 4 senators that have come into contact with it or exposed to it or have been tested positive for it, and everybody they've been in contact with has to also quarantine for an amount of time, it really can stunt the process pretty quick. In a very short period of time, it could all of a sudden be in a delay. And I can foresee us having a number of delays that we're having to be very cautious that until we can really wrap our minds around this thing and get some clarity on the how realistic the vaccines are how well those are working, and how well we're contact tracing, those types of things. I think it's just going to be a very unique session, just like 2020 was at the back half of it. I don't think it's easy to predict, but I would say that what it would be easy to predict is that there'll be people absent at varying times, and it'll look very different than it has in the past. And the building again will be quiet, I think, for most of the session.
Thank you. Just to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please use the question answer tab at the bottom of your screen and type that in, and we'll get that to both the representatives. One last question on the COVID issue is the issue around ratepayers' inability to pay their bills has come up multiple times this year at the Public Service Commission. Do you all feel that may in some fashion or form come before you in your committee, and any thoughts on what that might look like?
I haven't seen any bills that have been pre-filed. You know, I'm a volunteer board member with Consumers Council of Missouri, and that's one of the issues that we're quite concerned about. You know, there are still, you know, so many Missourians that are still unemployed and just don't have the source of income they need to pay everything that's come due, whether we're talking about rent, but utilities as well. So, you know, some of these things, I think the Public Service Commission has some tools at their disposal that they might be able to help us with. And, you know, but I certainly don't want utility companies to be left holding the bag on this either. We have to figure out a way that everything is balanced out. So, but I'm hopeful that in the 2021 session that we're going to have a lot of discussions about meeting the basic needs of Missourians. And that includes issues that all of us care about like energy, but also things like food and housing and everything in that regard. So, and, you know, one of the issues that didn't come up that I consider is COVID related is we are really seeing firsthand now the impact of folks not having access to broadband. There are a lot of Missourians who are unable to work from home, and a lot of Missouri students who are really struggling to be educated. And you know, so that's another issue that I hope we can address as well. We have to figure out a way to reduce these big disparities between the haves and the have-nots, and that includes many things.
And I would say, I think there has been a bill, at least last year, where the IOUs have been working with the broadband providers to get that line to the last mile using the existing infrastructure. And not just the IOUs, don't get me wrong, the co-ops have been leading the way on providing broadband to their customers for years. But is that something you guys expect to see this year? And any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually have a bill that I've filed that would take the Ameren smart grid that they're building out and use the infrastructure they're already building, the line they're already using, the fiber they're already using to create the smart grid. We want to be able to provide that out to internet service providers so they could lease that line that's being unused by Ameren that they're building out already for the smart grid. And the internet service providers could lease space on those lines all over their footprint and provide broadband services through that. And then the lease dollars would go back to the ratepayers, and the minimal expense that is tagged along on that for Ameren. But potentially a way to build out broadband in a unique way is, especially for Ameren's footprint, is to make use of infrastructure we're already building, we're already paying for as ratepayers, but to allow those to be bid out. And then also, you know, there's a really exciting announcement yesterday out of Senator Blunt's office where I think it's around $350 million for broadband from the federal government's coming in to build out broadband. Obviously, now's the time when we're all at home, we're all doing virtual things. Our kids are, you know, my 3-year-old is even doing virtual conferences with some of her preschool friends. And so, you know, the infrastructure is hugely important right now. And I think that's a combination of Missouri taking action, like this broadband bill that I hope we can get some movement on, but also seeing what the federal government is going to do on not only broadband, but their CARES Act funding. Some of the things they're helping us provide for communities across the state that we have to, because of our laws, we have to appropriate so the governor can actually expend those dollars. I think will be really important going forward too. And, you know, they're obviously in this big conversation about another stimulus package in DC, and that probably has some impact on our budget and how we can help those in need across the state, whether it's unemployment, continued unemployment payments, whether it's direct payments, whether it's PPP loans, whatever that can be. We need to take every avenue possible to try to help those in need. And I think Ameren and I think the utilities have done, at least to the extent that they can, they've tried to help in areas of need. I know Ameren did some announcements on providing some relief to those who've lost jobs or having trouble paying their bills. And especially going into the winter months, there's no more important time for energy companies to take care of those in need and to figure out paths for that than right now, when people on fixed incomes really struggle, or people that have lost their jobs and they have to stay home with their kids because their kids aren't in school. These are all really hard dynamics that we've got to be innovative, and government doesn't do innovation very well. But I think Republicans and Democrats, at least seemingly, have a desire to come to the table and figure out policy that can work to take care of our communities. I think we should be doing that.
Representative McCreary, any thoughts?
No, I agree with Representative Fitzwater. I'm hopeful, glass half full person that we can figure out some things that we agree on that can provide some basic assistance to Missourians. I talked to a mom the other day who has an adult daughter that is having to come to her house every day to take a shower so she can go out and look for jobs and things like that. So, you know, these are things like we can all philosophically say, well, people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But if you're unable to get gussied up enough to even go and have a job interview and apply for jobs, those are just things that are that a lot of our neighbors are struggling with right now.
Absolutely. So there's a question here about outlook for a new nuclear energy or renewable energy in Missouri. I guess let me phrase it this way, if I can. It seems as if we've seen a larger focus on Missouri-based renewable energy, the number of wind farms in Missouri being developed, large solar farms, both by the municipal and the investor-owned utilities, and with the issue of securitization that may bring the transition from the coal fire power plants that we have to something else. What are your thoughts on the longer view outlook for Missouri's energy portfolio, whether that's new nuclear, renewables, or a combination? Any thoughts?
I think if Representative McCreary, if you don't mind me jumping in on the nuclear stuff, it kind of excites me. The new technology is just really fascinating. Well, of course, nuclear technology has been innovating over the last 10, 15 years pretty significantly, but I think it just keeps building on itself. I think Idaho is installing a small modular reactor in the near future. I think the big nuclear plant is outside of other countries who don't have the regulatory environment that we do in America, are probably not going to be installed like they have been in the past, and we're going to look more at more smaller, efficient, safer modular reactors across the country. But there's some exciting stuff happening there across the board in nuclear power. Not only nuclear power, but economic development within the nuclear innovation space. You know, Missouri uses a research reactor, I think a 10 megawatt research reactor for cancer research and a number of other innovative technologies to help provide healthcare, which is super fascinating. And that research reactor pays for itself. About 80% of the research they get out of that pays for that project. So it's not really a state-funded project. It's a very well-run situation there. So I think nuclear is a huge opportunity for our energy future. And the reality is, with solar and with wind, you know, the wind's going to stop blowing and the sun's not going to be around. So you have to replace at some point until you can figure out battery power, which I think we're also is another exciting part of solar is the battery opportunities that are happening. You know, these gigawatt or gigafactories from Tesla and some of these other battery technologies. When you can start storing power, then that's really going to revolutionize, I think, energy infrastructure. But until then, you've got to figure out how to do baseload power, fill your baseload power needs. And that's why we can't retire these coal plants quite yet, is because we've got to figure out how to create that baseload need that our state demands to run all of our computers in our homes and all of our, and now to energize some of our vehicles. We have a significant need for energy. So there's a lot of exciting innovation happening, and I look forward to the future, because I think in not the too distant future, we're going to look very different as an energy environment, kind of in the energy world economy.
Well, I'd like to see us explore other ways to make additional sources of power. I mean, it's no secret that I'd like to see Missouri be a leader in renewable energy, but this ties back to a discussion you're going to have later. It makes no sense for us to make more power if we can't move that power around. So we also have to make sure that we're not putting up roadblocks. You know, if we want to build a small nuclear reactor, you know, we can't ban the use of eminent domain for some company that decides to do that. So we have to have a way to move that power around. And, you know, one of the things there are several participants on this call that work for groups that have been working for solar and other renewable energy sources for years, decades for that matter. But I'm really excited to see corporate America start to, you know, continue to partner and to work with things. Representative Fitzwater and I were really excited to see that Ameren just announced they have a chief renewable development officer in place. You know, so these are things I think when you look around and see that both, you know, nonprofits and citizens are calling for something, but also we see corporate America and some of these utility companies getting on board. To me, that makes me excited that maybe we're all going to be swimming in the same direction in the future.
And I think you see that too, some of Ameren's future plans. You know, they've released some of those plans that moved up their timeline on retiring coal power plants, because they see the future coming a lot faster than they originally thought. And that's how we ought to be doing, not necessarily, in my opinion, not necessarily through government mandate, like here's what you should be doing, because it's so hard for all of us to get our minds wrapped around policy in such a short period of time, like Representative McCreary mentioned earlier with term limits. But let the market kind of figure some of the stuff, and they are, with battery power, with solar energy. You know, there's some regulations we're going to have to probably in the future remove to allow large investment in solar farms. And, you know, there are large companies that are demanding the ability to use more renewable energy within the state. So, you know, we're gonna have to figure out paths to really open up the gates and kind of get out of the way for some of these companies to do the innovative things they'd like to take on. But without us even getting involved, they're doing a lot of this on their own. You know, I've just really appreciated Ameren in particular. And I know I'm a homer for Ameren because they're such a big part of my community. But they're doing some really great stuff that ought to be encouraged, and are really excited about what they've got going on.
Well, with that, we come to the close of your session. Thank you both very much for